be shy. Come on in. We will not pick on you. And if you're just browsing anywhere around the fair, do feel free to stick around, listen in. If you decide you want to grab a seat and there's a seat, go for it. The only thing we ask is if you keep the volume down, because it can be sensory overload if you're in the back rows and you are hearing voices from two sides. So quiet browsing during the event. I'm going to be back to introduce Tatevik in just a sec, but yeah, come on forward. Hello. Welcome to, the final stretch of this year's Radical Book Fair. My name is Myri. I run Lighthouse Edinburgh's Radical Bookshop, and it is such a treat to see you all here for Against Erasure. I'm going to introduce our chair, and then they're going to introduce our speakers. So here goes. Tatevik Sargsyan is the founding publisher and editor of Mack Press. We have some of the Mack books at the front by the till, and they are incredible. Mack focuses on queer experiences across borders and other stories told with no shame. As the only queer Armenian-led publishing press in the UK, Mack offers a home for cross-border dialogue and cultural exchange. Through groundbreaking anthologies, poetry and food events, residencies for poets, and collaborative international book events, Tatevik curates spaces for individuals to form and reform themselves, affirming their identities. Tatevik was born in Yerevan, Armenia, and is currently based in London. She's also a design strategist and a trustee of the Poetry Translation Centre. Would you please put your hands together for Tatevik and for our panel?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Loads of nods. Yes, welcome. Thank you to Lighthouse and Myri for organising this and inviting me to host this panel. I'm going to invite our panelists to introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll have time to find out more about themselves and also about their work as we go through today. So I'll come over to you first, Skye.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Skye Arundhati Thomas, and I'm here to talk about Pleasure Gardens, which is this one here, which I co-wrote with Izabella Scott over there with the camera. Miss you over here. But so we kind of wrote this book together. It's about essentially the accelerated military occupation of Kashmir, which began in August 2019. After India revoked Kashmiri special constitutional rights. And I guess it was an attempt to go into the Indian news cycle and find some kind of stillness and clarity and make a record of a very chaotic time, and also a time that was a bit kind of, it was erased in some senses because India imposed a 214-day-long communications blackout of Kashmir. So no news was kind of going in and out. It was like a very small trickle. So as you might imagine, there was a lot of fake news and propaganda swirling around, and we just kind of wanted to make a record that was as clear, concise, and sharp as possible, which is, I guess, an introduction of not only the book, but my own and our practice as writers. We're kind of writers and editors. We used to be editors of the White Review for a time before the hiatus. And now kind of writing books together. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. And Rosa.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming. It's really amazing and a bit astonishing to see you all here. I'm Dr. Rosa Campbell. I'm a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the University of St Andrews. And my work, or especially the work that's most relevant for today's discussion, has been mostly to do with kind of bringing back into the light and republishing and re-editing the work of the American poet V.R. Bunny Lang, who had been out of print for many, many years. And in general, thinking about the ways in which we can kind of recuperate and recover lost voices from the archive and kind of bring them back from the margins. So that's what a lot of my work is about, and it's specifically around poetry.
Thank you, Zozan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And it's my honor to be here. And I just would like to thank to Edinburgh Lighthouse Bookstore for building this beautiful space of reflection and community for us today to come and talk here. So my name is Zozan. I am Kurdish, and I have been living in Scotland for 6 years. And I'm a journalist, filmmaker, and researcher. So my work mainly focus on refugee, displacement, and intersection of conflict and politics. So I focus on bringing stories of underrepresented communities and Kurdish people and refugee. And we made 2 films, and one called My Refugee Life, and focuses on refugee experiences in London. And the other one is called We Depend on Each Other. And we just delve into understand as migrant women in Scotland how we are experiencing mental difficulties and how this can be challenging in Scotland and to deal with. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. We do a round of applause just to ease in. Thank you. Great. And I'm really excited to be part of this as well because I love archives. I don't work with them as often, but my favorite archives is the Bishopsgate Institute in London. And in the first and the last anthologies that I published with Animot Press actually deals a lot with archives. And the most recent one is an anthology of queer experiences across Indonesia and other Southeast Asian communities, and there we worked with the Queer Indonesia Archives, which is a grassroots collective in Indonesia that is archiving objects, texts, and journalistic interviews with queer communities across the country, which is very rare. So I also recommend you to check them out. And so we're here to explore how oppression often works through erasure, whether through deliberate silencing, historical omission, or the destruction of cultural memory. But we're also here to celebrate the works that push back, and that's the art, literature, archives that recover forgotten voices, challenge dominant narratives, and create new legacies. And as you've already had a glimpse of this amazing panelists, they're going to be discussing some of the examples of this and how they push back and how they develop these ideas further. And some of the themes that we're going to touch upon are things around the challenges of archival work, the role of art reclaiming erased histories, and how these projects of recovery help us to resist oppression. And I also encourage you to maybe start thinking alongside those themes and beyond of things that you might want to ask the panelists at the end, where we will have time for Q&A. I'll come back to that a bit more. And I want to start with the first question. So I think archives can be seen as tools for preservation, but also they can act as a resistance to erasure. So becoming these dynamic tools for reorientating our understanding of the present and what that means and how we want to move together as collectives. And I want to start with a broad question around that. So you already touched upon it in your introduction, but if you can expand a little bit more about your work in general and how archives are used within your work. And if there's something that you found surprising along the way to kick us off. Anyone want to start first? Rosa.
Oh. Yeah, so as I mentioned, my work is to do with essentially recovering poets who have been kind of erased from literary history for various reasons. And sometimes I think it's really clear to see that there's a kind of bias or a political agenda that has caused them to be forgotten, and sometimes not so much. Sometimes it's to do with the kind of vagaries of the art marketplace, or the people that make some kind of impression in their own time and then kind of continue to. But I think the thing about working with archives, and perhaps the thing that I've continuously kind of found surprising about it, is the ways in which it creates this real kind of intimacy between the past and the present. And that's even if you're working with quite a recent archive. There's still this sense of you're thinking about history, you're thinking about preservation, you're thinking about whose voices and artifacts and documents are getting preserved and whose are absent from the archive, and the ways in which the archive itself is not just this kind of raw material with no particular agenda, right? It's not a kind of like set of objective facts that then we can form a narrative out of. They have their own narratives. The kinds of things that are considered worthy of preservation versus those that aren't creates its own kind of narrative and hierarchy. And I think it's those moments, though, where you really feel like, for me anyway, thinking about kind of people, poets, there are people that I've worked on for a long time who I feel like I kind of understand them. And then you go into their archive and suddenly you're faced with the kind of real material reality of somebody. And even if it's fragmented, even if it's got a lot of gaps in it and kind of holes in the story, there's still this sense that in the archive you're touching something that somebody else touched. And that sounds so basic, but quite often, you're coming across this kind of document or item that, especially in my work, nobody else has really given a shit about for like 80 years. And it's been kind of misfiled or catalogued badly, or like nobody has really kind of paid that much attention to it. And then you're touching it and you have this moment of true intimacy with the past. And I think that's the thing that, for me, feels kind of still so fresh and kind of surprising about the archive.
Great, thank you. And Zozan.
Yeah. My work mainly focuses on basically testimonies. I call it testimony because I'm coming from a background that we were not able to access to any archives because there was systematic erasure was happening in Kurdish history. So, and when there is conflict, when long-standing conflict, when there is ongoing oppression and systematic violence happening in a country, it's really not easy to reach any archives or be able to basically understand what happened historically. So what I focus on mainly, if we cannot reach anything, what we can do is focusing on testimonies of people. So whatever I have done so far in my work, focusing on people experiences, and as you said, and it's beautiful and how it has relation with the past, and while we are working on a recent and ongoing situation and focusing on stories, present stories, but we touch directly to the past and people experiences, and this has been like the center of my work, and that's why I always bring stories of underrepresented people, Kurdish community, and refugees. And yeah.
I guess it's a little bit different, the kind of archival work that was at least involved in pleasure gardens, which maybe is not so unfamiliar now on like a global stage where if you look at the news cycle that we have today, with its overwhelming kind of barrage of not only daily atrocity and violence, we're kind of having to grow more and more accustomed to new brutalities every day with the genocide in Gaza, but also in terms of how so many sides of the situation have to kind of build their own narrative. And, as readers, we have to constantly shift through material and find the story, find the thing that we can trust. I've been saying this for a while, but that's how we've been living in India for almost 10 years now or more, since the first Modi government took hold. And what that situation has been is that the news cycle has been in a completely chaotic, unreliable, almost tormenting place. And every time I've begun a writing project, the idea was just to kind of go into the eye of that storm and try to somehow still it or find precision and kind of find a narrative. And I guess Pleasure Gardens was very much that, which is to go into a situation where there was no archive and to build an archive, or also in maybe even a step further, which is write the history without the archive itself. And so in the writing of this history, perhaps we built an archive, and the archive is very much in the book. So just to kind of give you a sense of what the book is like, it starts with the first 15 days of August when the military occupation of Kashmir started to get more and more intensified. And, we go day by day scraping through an enormous amount of news, like journals, magazines, newspapers, Twitter, or X, and Instagram, and kind of culled everything and brought things together and tried to make a narrative. And day by day, as we were writing it, it kind of took on this almost terrifying pace of a theatrical plot. And so in the archive, I guess, we found the drama that comes through. I mean, it's a horrid drama. And interestingly enough, when we were proofreading the book, it was around October last year, and it was as kind of the intensification in Gaza began, and it started to become clear that it was a genocide. We were proofreading this book, and just kind of starting to see the parallels of how occupying forces learn from each other and build together, which is again another archive that is so rarely built around how military strategies travel through the world. So I think it's very much a practice of building an archive in the absence of one, but also in a completely insane, terrifying world of fake news and propaganda, and having to just kind of trust yourself. So maybe that's what was surprising, is finding some trust.
Great, thank you, everyone. I want to delve a bit deeper into each of your works with some specific questions, and I want to start with you, Skye, and this idea of building up from nothing or actual active erasure, active disinformation spreading. Can you tell us a bit more about the kind of archival silences or gaps that you encountered in Kashmir's history, and how you navigated, how did you go on about building this archive or kind of putting this book together as a piece of archive? And maybe a bit more around the connections around India and Israel as well. Thank you.
So we made a couple of trips to Kashmir to begin writing the book, and I kind of made another one because we worked with 3 photographers in the book. So interspersed within the book are these 3 very beautiful photo essays, and they're 3 Kashmiri girls who run the only women-only photo collective in Kashmir, and they're working under some very extreme circumstances. They're amazing. And one of them was actually doing research up at the border between India and Pakistan, at the line of control, which is a kind of contested border since the time of Indian independence, and the formation of Pakistan, in the event known as partition, an extremely brutal moment of forced migration. And we traveled up to the border, which was, I was very lucky to be able to go with one of the photographers, Nawal, who's kind of working there. And while I was there, At the time, the book was very much about the first 200 days of the communications blackout, tracking the law, looking at the kind of different ways in which the Indian government would manipulate the constitution or indeed change it to, embolden its military force. And while I was there, someone kind of told me that there was 2 different kinds of barbed wire, and to watch out, especially for the Israeli one, because it could really cut a finger. And I was like, the Israeli one? And I guess it kind of opened up a whole new chapter, and indeed a whole new direction for the book, where we began to track the relationship between India and Israel. And this was this kind of began in 2021, so it's a while ago, and at the time things were not so well documented in terms of how the 2 countries were learning from each other and working together and building weapons together, and so kind of we began uncovering this history. And I'm Indian. I live in India. I wrote about Kashmir and other events in India in real time while they were happening. And yet, in the process of writing this book, there were moments in which I was completely surprised at what had happened. And this was one of the surprises, where actually India only normalized relations with Israel at the end of its last war with Pakistan, because of the very landscape that I was in at the border in the Himalayas, because the terrain is so rugged and rocky and kind of extreme. India needed new surveillance weapons, and made a huge order of unmanned aerial vehicles, or known as drones, from the Israeli government, and thus this blossoming friendship began. So I guess one of the interesting things about having to make an archive in the absence of one is you have to be quite open to go in directions that you might not have seen before. And also in some ways might not have kind of references to how it's been done elsewhere. We were really lucky to have a few writers like Azad Essa, Anthony Lowenstein. There was a few people who had been tracking particularly Israeli military infrastructure that gleaned, information around India's relationship to Israel. But in terms of how it kind of backdated, we really had to do that kind of work ourselves. As with any military occupation, the voice of the occupied is indeed completely squashed. So, having 3 Kashmiri photographers in the book was really important to us. I'll just say one last thing, which is, the kind of canon of war photography or military photography is very masculine, and also it's also one of crisis. And actually the story of military occupations in general, be it Palestine, Kashmir, or elsewhere, also around crises. And the thing about maybe the lived truth of a military occupation is that it's durational and it's constant and it's everyday life. And that was what was really singing to us in the work of these photographers. I'm going to try to show you some of the images. But
don't show them all, because they have to buy it.
Oh yeah,
just
okay,
one.
Just one
teaser.
Kind of a beautiful riverside landscape with the Israeli and Indian barbed wire. But what was very beautiful about these photographers is they were photographing crisis not through images only of violence, but of this kind of softer, more gentler kind of image of casting the eye elsewhere, like a picnic blanket kind of all ready with a little, the tip of a gun visible in the corner, just kind of making it very clear that occupation is not only comprised of extremity, and that's why we need to kind of end it, but also talk about it every day. So, yeah, sorry, kind of might have gone on too long.
That's fine, that's what you're here for. Thank you so much. It is really an inspiring, kind of continuously developing piece of work, and I hope you get a chance to read it or explore it and be with it if you haven't already. And when I started familiarizing myself with this book and with your work, it immediately inspired me and infuriated me that I wanted to do something similar to chart this connection between Israel, Turkey, and Azerbaijan and what they're doing together to Armenia and indigenous Armenians in Artsakh. So I already feel so inspired and so grateful how you're charting that currently for people to know and kind of take that away and do something with it. But moving on, Zozan, I'm going to come to you. So immigrant communities often face this double erasure, first through displacement, seeking asylum, going from countries to countries, and then through the systemic neglect they get when they end up in any given location. And your work is, with Kurdish people, but also a lot of other migrant diaspora communities. And I want to ask you something around, how you see your work addressing these multiple layers of invisibility and what archives plays a role in that.
That's a very good question. Thank you so much. So I came here as a refugee and getting this experience of living in the UK and also experiencing this double erasure, and was something that I was questioning all the time. So do we have really space here? Do we really have self-determination of expressing ourselves through our stories? So what I came up with is not about actually just only stories of other refugees, and take my experiences also into consideration, and then follow from there what are my experiences and how I can actually make my experiences through refugees' experiences also visible. So even though making those films were never easy for us, we experienced so many difficulties, and the sense of invisibility working with the UK production companies, that was one of the experience, and I even wrote a critic on making the film with a British company, and how it is difficult, even though we are the one to tell our stories, so we experience invisibility there. So what I do, and focusing on make this more visible, and focusing on their experiences, and making that central, and focusing with care, with love, with respect, with empathy. So approaching it through, it's as my story, how I want my story to be told, and how I want it to be visible, and raise my voice and make space for my lived experiences as well. So that's why always when it comes to talking about my work, and every single work I do, part of me in it, because I put my experiences into it as well, and all represent me overall. But seeing UK as a very hostile community, not community, the country, I'm so sorry. We have beautiful community in the UK as well, and hostile state and the country, and make things more difficult for so many displaced people. And now one of our film, so basically what we talk about, I am part of the film as well while filming. So how we are not finding a lens or an agency to represent ourselves the way we want. Because what I came across, my story, some of you, if you Google, you will see some of them on mainstream media in the UK, and that was done through some refugee organization. But I was never happy and traumatized. Seeing my story on some UK media outlet completely traumatized me. And so with this sense, and I was thinking on how we can center through our own stories and come together and talk about it and build a safe space for us to tell our stories in a way that's not going to re-traumatize us, because we already traumatized arriving here with so many difficult experiences. So yeah, this is one of my main focus I do.
Yeah, thank you, Zozan, for sharing and kind of revisiting that as well. I know it's a really difficult one for you personally, because you've lived through that, and I'm sure that's some of those aspects of that are ongoing as well. I'm going to move us on to the literary canon, maybe a bit removed from the very personal, and go to Rosa. And so you're working with kind of these established archives, but perhaps neglected, like you say, who gives a shit? You're like sifting through this dusty documents, objects. I want to ask you something around kind of how do you reconstruct a inclusive cultural narrative using these archives, where it can feel like they're actually fixed. This is what, era of writing or an era of art is supposed to be like, and some of these names or voices are missed out.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically exactly what Skye was talking about in terms of this idea of a canon, right? That there's a kind of established canon of literature, of art, in all of these different ways. And one of the things that archives can offer us is not just a kind of different story or missing people from that canon, but actually an entirely kind of new approach to a particular era or a particular kind of set of writers or artists. And I think it's really interesting. So the art historian Griselda Pollock talks about the problem of the counter canon, that it's really tempting, so for me as like a sort of feminist scholar, or as someone who works on queer writers, it's really tempting to look at an existing canon of straight white dead men and think, okay, well, you're telling me that these are the great artists of a particular era, and it's really tempting to want to just kind of put women or queer writers or writers of colour on that same kind of pedestal, and to create what Griselda Pollock calls a counter-canon, right? To be able to say, okay, I see your great men and I raise you these great women or great other writers. But the problem with that, she suggests, is that you're replicating the same kind of structures of exclusion, of erasure, if you kind of, you're kind of using, in Audre Lorde's terms, the master's tools in an attempt to destroy the master's house, and it'll never work. And so instead, I like to think about my work less as kind of valorization of individual writers. I mean, even though I love the writers that I work on, and I think they're brilliant, and that's why I'm interested in them. But in many ways, it's not as important to focus on those individual writers. It's less about Bonnie Lang in this case, and more about destabilizing the canon of American poetry at mid-century and being able to say, okay, if it can be opened up to include this writer who's been missing, then it can be opened up to include all sorts of other writers, all sorts of other narratives, all sorts of other stories. And so I think it's work that is less kind of about, trying to kind of lionize new voices and just repeat those same structures of exclusion. And I mean, especially with a writer like Bunny Lang, she was an upper-class Bostonian white woman. And so in many ways was yes, subject to patriarchal kind of exclusion in all sorts of ways, but in all sorts of other ways had huge amounts of opportunity and privilege. And so it's less about her individually and more about kind of trying to destroy something, trying to shake something up and say this period of time or this particular canon is open to revision. And if it can be revised by adding her or maybe not even adding her to the canon, but considering her story as part of that time period, then it can also be opened up to all sorts of other things. And perhaps this canon is not quite so kind of fixed as we thought it was.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad you touched upon Bunny Lang's privileges as well, because as I was reading and getting to know your work, I was thinking it's great that she's kind of contributing a part of this archive, the canon. But equally, there are so many others, racialized, the class privileges. What about those people? But I think, as you said, it's really important, this kind of creating this wedge just with this one writer makes us think that there are so many other lenses and people missing that could be contributing, and it's not about creating this new pedestal of another exclusionary set of people or art forms. I'm going to move us on to... Okay, good time. I'm going to move us on to thinking about art, archives, and activism. And I think for communities on the thread, archives can become a site of activism. And I was wondering what you think, whether your work is a form of activism, like this archival work is a form of activism. And if so, do you think there are these tensions between, or challenges that you encounter between, you know, archiving something, but also advocating? So, you know, for example, doing the advocacy work around hostile environment in the UK, or advocacy work around art forms, advocacy around genocide, oppression. Do you have any thoughts on that? Zozan, you're really keen to go first. Of course I'm going to come to you.
Well, I just need to say that activism was the first thing I did in my life when I was very young, and I involved in activism a lot. So, and through an activism, I have done archiving, and I remember, and I was 21 years old, and I had lots of great collection of people's stories and gathering, and then photography and video and other things, and I was arrested, and all of them gone. And that was so painful moment for me, because my computer and then my phone was not giving me back. So going back to your question and how, so there is little difference between advocacy and activism. So in advocacy, we put ourselves, our emotion, and we relate, we connect. And in archiving, it can be a little bit trying to stay a little objective of just building a stage for people to tell their story. And in this sense, and I think in my work, and I balance these two together, and sometimes my activism part more comes out, and unintentionally, even though I try to be objective and trying to focus on just bringing simple, but then coming from that oppressed community, and you always find a sense of advocacy there as well. So, and I think there is nothing wrong with this, and it's really powerful, and how we can bring the power of activism into archiving as well, because we have this approach of representing something, that if we are archiving something, so then there is also the representation lie under that. And so, yeah, and my quite related.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in?
So my first book, actually called Remember the Details, was about a kind of nationwide protest movement in India that took place in 2018 against very discriminatory and xenophobic new citizenship laws. So in a country where, you know, almost the majority of people are undocumented, so to speak, it was completely outrageous for the Modi government to start asking citizens for proof of ancestry, and essentially, you know, very specifically singling out Muslim populations to try and qualify them as kind of ingenuine citizens. So it broke off this huge kind of protest, and in some ways we were gripped by this amazing energy. I never kind of had experienced that before back home. You know, we were kind of at these sit-ins, like late into the night, like talking about democracy, and, you know, there was a kind of spirit in the air. And then, of course, it all came crashing down, as these things do. And COVID, you know, the pandemic was declared, and overnight the protest sites were kind of bulldozed over, and a group of primarily Muslim students who had, you know, many of them had been leading the movement, were incarcerated, most of whom are actually still in pretrial detention. And there was this kind of, it was a heartbreak. It was a great kind of disappointment. And around that time is when perhaps we started conceiving of this book too, was in the absence of an immediate kind of space for activism, or when you kind of see the narrative arc of at least one type of activism like reach a very sad end. I guess I was personally, as a writer, as a thinker, like scrambling with what the project was, or how to move, or where to go, and that's where I guess the desire to have clarity, the desire to make records, the desire to indeed even begin to write history and not just read it, became really strong. And a book like this was kind of born, and then meeting artists too that were kind of taking a similar approach, like the photographers, in just documenting painstakingly everyday lived life under occupation, and what kind of like historical narrative that can build. I guess now, today, there's this kind of resurgence of a revolutionary spirit is in the air again, as we have to, confront our, in some ways, like helplessness in the face of, the genocidal mania of our time. And I guess we're all maybe finding community in different protests and kind of reimagining what an activism may look like. And I feel definitely a bit jaded, but also I did want to say kind of maybe one thing, which is around advocacy or what the law can potentially do. And it feels strangely anachronistic to say this now, because my faith in the law is at an all-time low. But there, in this book and also in my first book, we paid very close attention to the law, because the law actually does something kind of interesting where it becomes an efficient record of a state's movements. Because every time a state has to kind of, do its little dance of intensifying its aggression, it has to, in some way, go through a legal process to make it happen. So in India, we have various kind of wild anti-terrorism laws. I'm hearing in the UK the anti-terrorism laws are being used to target journalists and activists, and it's, I guess, the anti-terrorism laws we have are probably British ones, and kind of tracking the amendments, the shifts, the ways in which laws are either used in conjunction or separately, thinking through how the laws are used in combination against certain offenses, starts to build a specific portrait of a time. And so, while perhaps, when we write a book like this and we kind of write this record, there was a really beautiful panel the other day, a kind of cabaret, and the writer Selena Godin, I think, she said, she writes for a future in which the book will be read, and it's really stayed with me. And I was thinking about how when we wrote this, we kind of made a record, the state's atrocities, its movements are kind of all laid out there. But never for a moment do I think that there will be a future in which there will be a grand trial, and the state's powers will be held into account. And I often feel that about Israel too. Like, will we in our lifetime see, these kind of genocidal maniacs be held accountable? Will we see that? Will we have a Hannah Arendt, chronicling the trials? And maybe not, but. What the law can do, instead of like a future resolution to a present tense crime, is perhaps do something else, which is maybe to have historical record, or begin to kind of help us understand how nation states legitimize their own brutality and coercion.
Thank you. Did you want to come in?
Just very briefly, to say that, I think I would be really hard pushed to describe a lot of the work that I do as activism, and on a much kind of smaller scale than anything either of you do. I think of my teaching work as the time in which my kind of like political principles are able to be kind of used in some way, on this really kind of individual level with students at what is a very kind of like elite institution, and the ways in which there's an assumption, I think, when they go to a place like St Andrews, that they are just going to be taught, the kind of the standard Western canon. And it's less about kind of like reforming a load of ex-public school students into realizing that there are other human beings in the world, and more actually focusing on the students who are there and they're the first in their family to go to university, or they've travelled a very long way to be there, or they've had care experience, or they are from refugee families, or they have been marginalised in any number of kind of other ways. And I try and present in my courses not just kind of poets or writers that resemble exactly their experiences, but also to try and kind of approach this kind of unstable canon in a way that allows for their own insertion into it, right? And I think that, as I say, it would be self-aggrandizing to call that any form of activism. It's literally just my job. But I do think that I have heard from students the significance of being taught, writers who they didn't expect to encounter. And in that sense, I think, we all know from what we've heard about Palestinian poets who have been killed, who have been imprisoned because poetry is deemed genuinely dangerous to the state. And I think that it's kind of, there's always a real significance in teaching certain artists.
Thank you so much. I've got about 1 million questions in my notebook, but we've only got 15 minutes left. So I'm going to maybe ask one more question, actually. I thought you were coming to grab this mic. I was holding it really tight. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I will open up to the floor. And if you're shy, I've got enough here, so don't worry. But please do ask. A question I really wanted to ask is something that you have maybe, found in working with archives, or like you've discovered. Like, can you explain a bit more about like this feeling or this? What does it give you? This act of recovering something in the archives, where you reflect and think, this. Everyone needs to know this. How is this hidden? Like when you feel like you've come upon something gold, can you explain a bit about that? Like what was that feeling for you in this work, in your latest works? Zozan?
Okay, maybe I can go. Well, I have so many moments to talk about, but I will give an example. So I'm coming from an area that during 90s, the state burned down over 3,000 villages, and there was a mass displacement of Kurdish community, and most of them had to move, and that they called internal displacement, of course, because we don't have any support argument, any support from the international community. And this community is spread around all Turkey, and during my time journalism, when I was working, and I interview some survivors from those villages. And I think that was in a moment I both emotionally struggle and amazed by people, how their resilience and how they resisted against this, but how still they care, that hope of returning and reconnecting with their land, because it's the same with my family happened, but going back and into researching and asking or trying to find out and archive this, for example, was not something easy for me to do as well. And I had to meeting all those people and interviewing them, and especially in how every day they were living, and one day we're going to go back to our home. But this displacement happened during 90s, and we are talking about just recent, like a few years back, and still people carry this hope and cannot actually face the reality of, no, we are not going to back to this home, our villages. So that already happened. And I was really amazed at how people unconsciously created a space of resistance. So because we have a word, we say barkhwadan jiana, it's a life resistance. So your existence, the resistance is life. So your existence is based on your resistance. And if you do resist, so you can exist. And so that's the thing I want to say.
Thank you. Rosa?
I mean,
one.
The kind of, okay, yes. the kind of most important thing in any of this work for me is not anything that I've particularly worked on. It's the work of Saidiya Hartman, who I feel like you can't have a kind of panel like this on archives without talking about her work. She's this absolutely incredible American scholar whose book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, I definitely saw somewhere over there, so you can pick it up. And essentially one of the things that she has kind of brought to archival study is the idea of what she calls critical fabulation, which is basically when you are faced with an archive that has huge gaps, huge silences and erasures, that one of the ways that you can tackle that as a critic, as a scholar, is actually imaginatively. And she, in particular, is looking at thinking about the histories of enslaved people. And she has this completely astonishing article where she thinks about two girls on a galley slave ship and imagines this whole kind of incredibly tender, wonderful relationship between them that has not come directly from the archive, right? It's not based on, specific documentation. Because these women are so completely erased, women like these imagined women are so completely erased from that archive, that instead she kind of uses everything she does know to construct this incredibly kind of emotional, poignant depiction of an interpersonal relationship that simply has no historical documentation whatsoever. And I think that possibility, right, that way that you can look at an archive and look at its gaps and its erasures and find a way of dealing with that that is so kind of, has such liberatory potential and such significance, for me has been kind of like, has changed entirely the way I do any work of any kind. So I actually can't even remember what your question was, but I think I just wanted to talk about Hartman.
But I was enjoying it because I also love Saidiya Hartman, so I really loved what you shared. I'm going to open it to the floor, see what we get, and then we can always come back to our questions.
There. Okay. This one online is from Jade, who said, if someone were to find a cache of lost documents and film and artifacts for a particular moment, movement, or place, and ask you to shepherd that archive into the world, what time, place would you hope for it to be? Thanks, Jade.
I mean, that's a totally incredible question. And at the moment, the kind of archive that I am like thinking about and dealing with at the most is actually the archive of Loud and Proud, Scotland's LGBT choir, of which I am vice chair. And it's our 20th anniversary next year, and we are currently sifting through the stuff that has not been properly archived in any way, shape or form of this one very particular community organisation. And so if someone wanted to uncover huge amounts of stuff to help the team that is putting together that exhibition, my completely flippant answer is that that's what I would like.
Yeah, I'd love the last year. Very nicely packaged in a clear timeline, just so we could make sense of it. That would be great.
Yeah, I think what I would do to focus on my most footage archives to uncover some stories that need to be told and for underrepresented community.
Can you hear me through the mask? Is that okay? Yeah. Great. From what some of you have said, the material that you deal with can be very painful and traumatic and personally affecting. And as a writer and researcher myself, I was wondering, how do we care for ourselves and care for each other through this process of uncovering and sharing really difficult and painful realities, in order that you can sustain and continue doing the really important work that you're doing.
Yeah, that's an amazing question and actually so important. And I guess I would say the collaborative method, or kind of finding ways to work together is really incredible. I mean, Izabella and I, it's very difficult to write something together. It's very rare to be able to find that. And I guess we started kind of swapping drafts and going into them and kind of trusting each other in this like quite mad and amazing way. And through that, I guess we were able to hold each other through a very difficult, painful, chaotic, I keep saying chaotic, but just desperately chaotic, set of moving parts. So I think, especially as a writer, it's so important to have other writers around you, to share things with, editing each other, reading each other. I think that's what I would say, is kind of find other writers, other readers, surround yourself with people that you can talk about the work on the level that you need to meet at the work's, position.
Just it reminded me the word Chimamanda Ngozi was saying, stories can break the dignity of human, and stories can repair the broken dignity. And I think when we approach this with care and with space of solidarity, that helps us a lot. What motivates me is if I'm doing something right and what I am doing, and that's a great motivation. And in terms of care, and I rely on my community and people around me. I can call them and cry, hey, this happened, and I need space. So, and I think we should have like people around us to be able to and share those moments as well. And I know that how my work was so traumatizing, and how many times I found myself in a situation that I could not go forward and write. Like, for example, I cover Yazidi genocide, and I went to there in Kurdistan, and I worked there, and I brought lots of images. But I was not able to look at any of those images for like a few months, because it was so traumatizing for me and have this experience. And until I made sure that I was ready to go through them and then write, and I was able to at least bring some work together and raise their voice through that as well. So it's not easy to touch, and especially when we have lived experience of this and empathy with those people, and or whatever we do in our archive. So yeah, and solidarity.
Is there another question in the room? Don't be shy. While you're thinking, do you want to ask a final question then?
Okay.
Yeah, no, you're great. It's quite a simple question, but I just wondered why your book is called Pleasure Garden.
Yeah, that's really great, because I forgot, to say. And I was like, how do I bring it up? So actually, we're hoping it's a kind of way to get people to pick up the book without realizing how violent it is in one way. But actually, the real truth of it is that most of the torture camps and black sites in Kashmir are in old Mughal pleasure gardens. So, gardens with names like the Palace of Fairies and, the Garden of Almonds. I mean, obviously in Urdu, Badami Bagh, Pari Mahal. They're now kind of been taken over by the Indian Army, razed to the ground. And one of the things that the book tracks is the kind of pleasure economy that the Indian government is selling now of Kashmir. Because Kashmir is largely in the Himalayas, very, very kind of amazing landscape, and trying to kind of have this big tourism boom around normalizing, I guess, occupation by kind of generating a tourist industry around it. So it was also a comment on that, on this kind of idea that, you know, you could arrive in Srinagar and drive to the lake and sit on one of those like long, relaxing, you know, gondola-style boats and be taken around while, you know, barbed wire and drones fly around. So we kind of wanted to really highlight that terrifying juxtaposition. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for your questions. I don't have time to ask any more questions, but before we wrap up, I wanted to invite Zozan to read a little...
I was about to forget that.
Someone had to remember to read a little lyrical piece to wrap up our thematic panel, and then we can do rounds of applause after that. Thank you.
I just wanted to close with a little lyric. And after the Jina Amin is dead in Iran by the morality police, she was killed in 16th of September 2022. So when Kurdish artists and musicians wrote a lyric, and Shia Madani wrote a lyric about this, and it's about invisibility of the Kurdish people pain. For Kurds, for Lords, Arabs, Belujis, for all the people without rights, for centuries of oppression, of submission, for cultures and identities buried alive, let's now write this song once again, with my pain also visible. This time, let's make sure your freedom aspires to set all of us free. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you again, everyone, and to our panelists. And please support independent publishing. Please buy our books. They're all available here. And if you have any questions, you can just find us here. We're going to be around. And also, people are going to be signing books on the right-hand side over there if you want to go and ask questions or just pick up a book. And thank you again.